Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our Module 10 TEL 712 discussion this evening. I'm Kelly here with Sandra, Melissa, and Kamara, and we are discussing the fun statistics book, Statistics and People. Kamara, what's the name of it? Who think they hate statistics? Something.
Yes, statistics for people that think they hate statistics.
Exactly. So we are just going to jump into the discussion. I will get us started. Nice, short, simple chapter. We were kind of talking about this before we got in here. It was a nice, easy read, given a lot of the deep reading, certainly not pedagogy of the oppressed or anything like that. So was happy for that. But I really like the way the authors related a lot of the definitions, very concise and giving a lot of they laid out how the book is gonna play out for the rest of it, and that it was not condescending, but it's very relatable to anyone, whether at any level of statistics. If you have no experience with statistics, personally, I actually do like statistics. I took an intro to statistics quite a while back, but so some of the terms are slightly familiar, but the way that these authors captured just for example, when they talk about inferential, descriptive, and correlational, and just how they gave the history. And I thought that was a really interesting opener and interactive, engaging hook. One of the definitions that they talked about that I really related to my specific problem of practice contextually, though, was representative sample. And so the idea of representative sample is that, a population is a large number. So you could say, all of the middle school teachers in Florida would be a population, but that would be hundreds of thousands. And in a research paper, you could not possibly interview and talk with all of those teachers. So you would pick a smaller subset of that, a sample. And the idea of representative is that that smaller subset would represent all of the middle school teachers in Florida, for example, or whatever it is that you were doing. So my concern, my problem of practice is, right now, the current flavor or iteration of my problem of practice is co-designing effective online learning experiences to facilitate adoption of inquiry-based learning frameworks and maker technologies. And my sample that I have are educators who are actually already in maker classrooms. And so I think and I do this with all statistics because I've taken statistics, and I took statistics and psychology. I'm going a little bit down a rabbit hole here, but I took them together. And when I see things on the news, for example, now about 80% of, Americans think blah, 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 I know from those two classes that is not 80% of all Americans. It's 80% of these 100 people they surveyed. Well, what if all those people lived in Wisconsin? They may think whatever they think about cheese or whatever it was that they sampled. So again, trying to get back on track here, I always question that representative sample and how I'm going to relate this in my paper and explain that the sample, and I guess you do this when you talk about your context and you talk about your participants, and then they'll know that that's the sample. But I'm just always wanting to get to true data and true science. And so that whole representative sample is something that is just an intriguing concept for me. And I want to make sure that I, just stay true to the research and that the numbers reflect that. But yeah, and that was why I really like taking statistics and psychology together, because they really went hand in intro, again, undergrad classes, but they went hand in hand explaining when you see all these surveys and they say this is what people think, these are the numbers they come from. So anyway, I guess that was kind of my observation. So
I can jump on there if it's okay, because I was making a connection in my mind when you were talking about the representative sample. With my POP, my sample is all of my kindergartners. So I'm not really extrapolating unless I want to go out beyond my school. And yet there's another way to think about it. When we look at the descriptive statistics, right, the central tendencies, and we're looking at the mean, I actually collected my data. So I have the quantitative results for the head, toes, knees, shoulders assessment that I did for the kindergartners, pre and post, and also the teachers' surveys of strengths and difficulties questionnaires. So it's nice because I got the pre and post means for both of those, and I can see if there were any changes, and I can compare them and triangulate that data, since one was from me and one was from the teachers. And I found positive results, actually, just in like the mini intervention I did. There was like a 15.88% increase in my scores for self-regulation for the students, and the teachers showed decreased internalization problems, externalization problems. So internals like emotional, or peer problems, conduct, and impulsivity would be the external. And then their pro-social, their positive behavior, wanting to help people, did increase. So it all like actually started to change in the right direction, which was kind of cool. But when I looked at all their scales, like all the different scores, there was crazy variability. So like here I can look at the mean and say, oh yeah, in this sample, like which was in all my students, it went up, but that still doesn't really accurately show what's going on, because there's like some kids who are still so not self-regulated, and some who were and didn't change, right? So just different ways to think about the same thing, like, is the data really showing an accurate representation of what's going on?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, there's always outliers too. Like that was one of the things that they didn't bring up that word yet in here, but like with data, they did talk about though, like how your like the fulcrum and the saw, I thought was a nice analogy they were talking about with averages, and how you can really get it thrown off balance by one of those like crazy outliers.
Yeah.
For sure.
I think, Melissa, just to play off a little bit on what you're looking at, right? So when you look at, how many students do you have in the
Only 25 kindergartners.
So I think it's interesting, like when, in the youth development space, we were always talking about like the delta, right? The change from pre to post, and being able to, I think this is, I don't like statistics, but I also did well in statistics, but that was like when the dinosaurs were on the earth. So this long period of time, and I don't use it the same way. So getting back into SPSS, like it's Windows based now, it's just crazy. But like thinking about how you can start to parse out in future, right? Not now, the delta for each of those students. If you had 25 students, their average mean pre versus their average mean post is telling you one story.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, if you had half of those students whose delta between their pre and the post was really high, versus others whose delta, that change isn't that high, and then you sort of pull out those students for whom it was high, you get to know who they are. I think this is where you start to look at like how application to practice really, this is how it comes to life in the real world, right? Like practitioners look at this stuff and they're like, hey, what is this telling me? But then we go back and we say, let's reverse engineer and think about those kids for whom the intervention worked so much. And it's really interesting when you start to put all of this work back into practice, because it means something very like it's a different kind of utility for people on the ground that can then redesign programs or specify a different population for whom the intervention is much more successful or much more impactful. And it just made me think about that, because you're right. Like I remember seeing when it was time to look at these big data sets at Big Brothers Big Sisters, you could just, focusing on one number could tell you nothing, right? Or you put all your eggs in that basket, and if it wasn't a statistically significant number, or when you compared it to other interventions in the field of education, that it's really hard to make the kind of changes that we want to see in most cases. But a small change for a big problem is one thing, versus a big change for a small problem is a whole nother issue. So everything is context. And I thought that was a really interesting. I'm excited for you. It must be so exciting to have data to like look at it.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be. I'm sure I will, I think at some point, but I'm not sure what kind of scale I'll use for my action research. Right now I'm focusing a lot more on qualitative. So the coding for me, like the last assignment, was more in alignment with where I'm at right now with cycle 1. But but similar to what you were saying, Kelly, just the idea of, you know, the representation, the representative samples, I think the demographics and the descriptive statistics are going to be really important for me. And I'm always fascinated by the difference between mean, median, and mode. It hurts my brain. I know they're simple and straightforward, but when put into practice, they really, and I think the book did a really nice job of showing you how misleading things could be, constructs could be, if not really broken apart, and sort of, if you don't look under the hood to see what's really making up that number. I just wonder how much of the stuff that we're reading out there is skewed in the wrong ways because we're not asking those questions. But
yeah, it kind of takes me back to the first class we had with Professor Wynn, right, where we were, you know, challenged to start to read some of those articles and look at some of those you know, conclusions that were being made to say, do you agree with it? Do you think it was an appropriate conclusion? And, you know, working in academic medicine, this is the career of many of the people that I work with, is writing academic articles and doing these studies. This is what they do. And, you know, they'll jokingly say, but there's truth to it. You can make the data tell whatever story you decide to tell, right? And I think that's where, not to get overly deep on us necessarily, but to me, that's where like our character and our integrity and ethics come into some of this work as well. And I realized that we weren't quite talking about that here, but that sense of, right, even representative sample, Kelly, to your point, right? Like, how generalizable are these things? And when we're writing up the results, you know, are we doing it in such a way that we're not over or under emphasizing what it is, the work that we've done, right? And I was thinking about how Mertler, like, there was that early on where it was like, you know, where you would don't make definitive statements. It would be like, this may lead to, or right. And that whole, like, that idea of how we use statistics to, again, show directions of things. But in many cases, even the statistics that we're pulling together may not be definitive in and of themselves because of the representative sampling or the populations that we're working with, and whether or not that's wholly generalizable. And it's just important for us to keep that in mind. I have a undergrad in psych, so I took psych stats, and then I have my MBA, so I took business stats. So I've sort of seen it from all sorts of different angles. And this is probably the psychologist in me, but I pulled out two things from the chapter that for me were really important, that were less about the statistical concepts, because I'll be honest with you, probably a lot like most of you, I was like, yep, mean, median, mode, done it a million times, right? And I thought I loved the humor with which the authors are approaching the subject. But here's what I was like telling myself, and this is probably a little bit of revealing me, but number one, you're not dumb. When I thought about, he kind of goes 10 ways to learn statistics and use this book, right? And I think when I thought about getting my doctorate, it was statistics that freaked me out the most. Like, am I going to be able to do this? I've always had a thing about math. I'm like totally right-brained actress, wanted to be a Broadway star, right? So anytime you start thinking about math and quantitative, I've told myself a single story and a narrative for a long time that I'm not smart enough to do this. And so doesn't matter what credentials I have or haven't gotten, I still just believe I'm not smart enough. So I thought that was really great. And then number 10 was have fun. And I'll be honest, as I was struggling with the first assignment, like just trying to understand the instructions today, I was like, this is not fun. I'm not having fun. But I feel like that's what I want to try to hold on to as we go into this, right? So have fun looking at mean, median, mode, and what is this telling me? And Sandra, you were talking about like, what could we discover in this that could be really powerful, and maybe be less worried about, am I smart enough? And am I good enough? And do I belong here? Because I still struggle with that. But really try to say, what cool things could I learn? And I think particularly as I start to get my own data, to just try to keep that mindset, I think that's going to be really hard for me, but I think that's what I'm going to try to pull out of this.
So I want to put a pin in something that you're saying, because of course you go there, and I love that you go into sort of like this is like, I just had like a critical pedagogy moment, right? Which is like, this is about accessibility to me. Like, this is
Mhm.
about reminding us that we all need to know this. Like right now in higher education, big data is one of the most important competencies that we can have our students leave with.
Yeah.
And we can't be afraid of this. So I really appreciated the book this morning. When I was reading it, I thought, like, are they for real? Like, is this for real? For real? Like, they're joking and they're funny and it's haha. And I'm thinking, okay, this is exactly the way I like to like onboard into something that I'm scared about.
Right.
And yet I know that I need to make meaning, right? So you could be really good computationally. You can get these concepts, you can see algorithms in your sleep, and that's one thing. But if you cannot make meaning of it so that we can do something with it and turn that data into wisdom, or turn that insight into wisdom, then that's all it is. It's just like, it's an intellectual exercise. And that's where, like, when you talk about your psychology and like your organizational behavioral psychology experience, Kamara, for me, it's the way I use numbers like this was to improve programming on the ground for kids. It's like, it makes sense for us, because then we determine where we're going to, send more resources to, what programs we need to sunset, what kind of students this is best for. And so I think that that's what motivates me to come closer, and I just have to take baby steps. So like, even the exercise part 1 and part 2, I'm talking out loud to myself like all day, like, okay, these 3 things are telling me what, and it's that simple. And even when you get into some of these more complicated things, they're not hard. It's just when the data sets get bigger, and obviously, yes, it gets much more complicated. But I think if we can just keep sort of that beginner's mindset around, this is not hard, and we have to embrace it more. And I look at it from a critical pedagogy, like more of the world needs to not be afraid of statistics, because it's such an important competency for us to be able to make this world a better place, like to really right size certain things.
Especially, I love what you're saying, Sandra, and I'm 100% in support. I feel like, especially because we're women, I don't know, maybe, right? Like, I just feel like statistics is male dominated. And so I really want to get to a place where I know it and I feel confident being like, no, I understand this research and this is what I'm reading, right? Because that's always been a sort of hang up of me. In the back, I read the articles and I'm like, I really don't feel confident saying I can, whether this is truly valid or not, right? So thank you for that, because I totally agree. And the baby steps, I related to that because I read the book, and same thing, I enjoyed their humor, and I was like, oh, this would be a class I would love to have live, because these guys just seem like they'd make it really fun. But what my experience has been with all the statistics I've had too, has been like, the first 5 minutes is like, yay, this is a number. And then it's like, you turn the page and it's like another language. You're like, why did we go from 0 to 100? Like, so I'm hoping they continue with that very slow process.
Agreed.
Chapter 2 remains very accessible. I don't know what it'll be past that, but chapter 2 is still very accessible.
I'm going for the smiley faces, and they're starting to like shrink in numbers. I'm like, no.
Well, at least we know that the humor will probably be there. So like, it's definitely a humorous book. Was appreciative of that, and like, they're aware of all these feelings too, because they point out these things in their jokes of like, so I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see how it continues on for sure. So we are up to the end of our time, but thanks so much for joining us, and thanks everybody for sharing. I think it felt really good tonight to have something that was like so complicated, but again, just like the ease of reading it and the ease of talking about it, honestly, like very naturally. I really appreciated all the time. So we will see you all in the next discussion. Have a great night. Bye.